Hey, welcome back to the one-year Bible journey, especially for beginners. I'm Pastor Cary, and this is the Growing in the Gospel YouTube channel. We are celebrating today that this is the 25th week of our journey. So as of next week, officially, we'll be halfway through this journey. I'm so glad you're taking the journey with me, and today is a big day. This week is big. I mean, we had some big reading in the Old Testament in 2 Chronicles. And now we are turning to the book of Acts. So let me tell you what the reading is for this week. 2 Chronicles 1 to 16, Old Testament. Acts 26 to Romans 2, that's New Testament. That's what we're going to talk about today. And then Psalm 74 through 76. So grab your notes or a Bible, maybe pause the video, get a cup of coffee or your favorite drink. And let's dive in for the next few minutes to this week's reading. We have some great reading, and we are crossing a big milestone this week, and I think you'll see it and enjoy it. So we're in the book of Acts. We're starting in chapter 26, but you need to remember in the narrative, where did we leave off? Paul has been 2 years imprisoned in a city called Caesarea, which is on the northern Mediterranean coast of Israel. Why is he there? Because he was taken hostage at the temple grounds. The Jews wanted to kill him. The Romans protected him because he's a citizen, and they snuck him out of town overnight. The last few chapters we've read over the 2 years that he was there, his trials. He has been giving his testimony, finally appealing. He's in a sense been defending himself and sharing Jesus. Finally, he appealed to Rome, so he's waiting for that case to move forward to Rome, to Caesar. And while he's waiting, King Agrippa, one of the Roman-appointed kings of the region, comes to see Paul and hear him. Paul is able to share his testimony with him and a man named Festus, who is the governor that is appointed in that area. Festus didn't really know what to do with him, so when Agrippa came through, he said, "Hey, I want to talk to you about this man Paul." And Agrippa said, I'd like to hear from Paul. He'd heard the story. He was familiar with the story. God's gone before Paul in this. And so when we left off chapter 25, Agrippa and his wife Bernice have called for Paul. Paul is about to open his mouth and testify. So when you pick up chapter 27, or 26, that's what you're reading. You're reading Paul speaking in the trial room at the palace at Caesarea after more or less 2 years, and he's testifying before Agrippa and his wife. It's really an interesting chapter because Paul starts by complimenting him and identifying with him and so relationally, presenting himself. And then he begins to talk about what he used to be, how he used to be so zealous for Jews and Jewish things, Jewish laws, and proclaiming his innocence. But then he begins to tell his story. And I said it before, but the power of your testimony is something that you should take very seriously. You should share your story. And it's so unconfrontational. I'm not opposed to confrontation, but it's so gentle to say to somebody, "Could I share my story with you?" And I said it last week. It's even cool to say, "Would you share your story with me?" And I'd like to share my story with you. And when you get to testify of Jesus through your story, it's a powerful and a compelling thing. So Paul straight up tells him the story, and Agrippa is almost amused. Agrippa is like, "You think this quickly you can persuade me? Are you trying to persuade me to be a Christian?" And Paul says, you bet. I wish you and everybody I know would become a Christian. The chapter ends with Agrippa telling, basically postponing his decision. He's not convicted in that we can see. It seems like he might be considering it, but that's not really the sense of the text. It's almost like he's marveling that Paul is thinking he can convince him. And Agrippa says to Festus, if this man hadn't appealed to Caesar, we could let him go. There's no case. Well, he's appealed to Caesar, and so chapter 27 is, and this is a great chapter, so take your time. It is Paul finally being released to journey to Rome, sent to Rome under Roman guard with other prisoners. So they board a ship in Caesarea, and they sail north, and then they cut towards Rome. They cut west kind of between the island of Cyprus and the coast of Turkey. And they're sailing, and it's not the best season for sailing. It's the end of the sailing season, which is probably November. The weather seems to be getting bad a little bit earlier than usual. And there's this long season through the winter that they typically don't sail. They'll winter someplace. But these guys decide to sail on anyway. You're going to read they make several stops. They change ships along the way. And this chapter is going to read like a novel. It is an amazing chapter of nature and God and providence and Paul and Romans and sailing, staff and criminals all on this ship thrust into this together. And Paul, this man of God, becoming the de facto or the default leader because nobody else knows what to do. And God showing himself, manifesting himself to these captives on this ship. It's so cool. It shows us that God wants everybody to be saved. Romans, Jews, Gentiles, everybody. He wants the wealthy, the powerful, the criminal, everybody in between. So they decide against good judgment not to winter in Crete or near Crete. They decide to sail anyway. They decide to hedge their bets and just take their chances and sail. And they launch out from Crete, and the weather changes on them. And all of a sudden, literally a hurricane, you might call it a nor'easter, a hurricane comes out of the northeast, sweeping down upon them. And for days, many days, they are swept up into this ship, into this storm in the Mediterranean. And they are suddenly having to literally bind the ship to hold it together. They're having to lighten the ship, throwing their goods overboard and trying to survive. It is a terrible ordeal that lasts for days and darkness and disorientation. And to their south lies these sandbars off the coast of North Africa. And if the storm blows them, which it coming out of the northeast, it would blow them that direction. They're afraid of hitting into the sandbars. Now, here's what's cool about this. So many cool things about this story, but you got to remember this. God has told them, he's told Paul, you're going to Rome. You're going to testify of me in Rome. God has a big plan for Paul in Rome and a lot of work that Paul's going to do. Oh, another note, Luke is with Paul on this journey because throughout the story, he says us, we and us. So make note of that. Luke is with Paul, with these criminals, with the Roman guards, with the staff of the ships and vessels. So they're binding the ship. They're afraid of the sandbars. It's a tumultuous, high-speed, fast-paced adventure. They're throwing stuff overboard. They're fighting the storm for many days. They're totally lost at sea. In the middle of all this, an angel appears to Paul. Again, God comes to Paul a third time and says, don't be afraid. Isn't this awesome that God ministers to us this personally, this up close, this intimately? And you're no different, okay? Paul's not a hero. I'm not a hero. These biblical characters are just like us. They struggled with fear. They struggled with anxiety. They struggled with depression. They struggled through one day after another. The angel of God comes and says, Paul, don't be afraid. Everyone that stays with you on this ship is going to be saved. Everyone. You're going to be shipwrecked, but every life is going to be spared. So Paul wakes up with this great confidence, this great assurance, this great joy, and he begins to minister to the fear and the anxiety on the ship. And it speaks to how God uses believers, even weak PTSD, flawed believers like you and me, okay? He can use us if we will live and operate in the promise, in the strength, in the grace that he offers us. If we'll live in the fearlessness and the faith and the stability and durability that he offers us. All through the book of Acts, we have witnessed fearful, fickle, fragile followers of Jesus become uncommonly courageous and uncommonly strong and durable and endure suffering, endure martyrdom, endure all these things that are coming upon them. Why? Because the grace and the strength and the power of God is very, very real. We have to walk in it. We have to live in it. We have to have confidence in it. We have to be courageous in it. We have to decide to operate in it and from it. But when we do, It surges. It's real. God holds us together, and he uses us to help other people be held together. So that's really cool. So Paul becomes the leader. He takes charge. The men are about to abandon ship. They're going to kill the prisoners. And he basically stands up and tells them what to do and says, you're all going to die unless you stay with me. At that point, he feeds them. I love it. Hey, let's eat. Guys, trust me. God appeared to me. He told me the story. This is what's going to happen. Let's eat. So 276 people on board. They eat. They still throw some cargo overboard. Finally, the ship runs aground, but it runs aground shy of the island that they see. The ship is wrecked against the waves and the rocks. And again, they're about to kill the prisoners. But Paul finally says, don't kill. Everyone abandon ship. We're all going to be saved. They're clinging to boards and, they're finding their way to the island. And what do you know? They all get ashore, 276 people. They all listen to Paul. They all arrive safely. It's a miracle. It is a harrowing journey, but God shows himself active and present, and things are about to get even cooler. Chapter 28, they land on this little island just south of the nation of Italy called Malta. Malta, this little dot, this little speck, but an amazing story unfolds in chapter 28. The people of Malta welcome them, warm them at a fire. Paul gets bitten by a snake that comes out of the fire. It's a poisonous serpent, so they're waiting for him to die. They're thinking he must have been a really bad dude. He doesn't die, so now they think he's a god. They're going to worship him. He denies the worship, and the people take him to the leader of the island, Publius. Publius has a father who is sick, and Paul not only doesn't die from the snake bite, but heals Publius and begins to heal others that are sick on the island. And so what do you know? All the people on the island, and most likely all the people that sailed with Paul, become believers. A massive spiritual revival for the gospel happens in this epic moment on this island that transpired through all these tragic circumstances. Do you ever feel like you're the victim of random events? That is never the case if you're a follower of Jesus. You are always in the grip of grace, moving forward in the script that God is writing, and in every situation he's at work, and in every part of the story he's at work, and he's most likely culminating things, details that are going to lead to gospel opportunities, missional, purposeful, meaningful opportunities for you by the grace of God. That is exactly what happens. Church tradition says that Publius became the pastor of the church on the island of Malta. I've never been there. I intend to go there. I've done the journeys of Paul 3 different times, but I've never gotten that far over to Malta and Rome, but I intend to. And I've heard it's an amazing spot to visit. And so Paul and his new church on the island of Malta, what do you know? God is gracious. So they finally are there a long time. They send them away, and they begin to journey up the coast towards Rome. So they land, they get on the land, they get up onto the Appian Way, the road to Rome, and Paul is journeying. The believers in Rome hear that he's coming. They leave town, they meet him at 2 different junctures. He's met, can you imagine how cool this is? Paul has had this long 3 missionary journeys. He's wanted to get to Rome forever. He's had this long journey from Jerusalem, years now in prison, and now months at sea, finally gets on land, walking north, and he's received by these believers who meet him. And they walk with him into town. I'm getting chills as I'm telling this story. What an awesome welcome. It to me, it's a foreshadowing of when we die or when we are raptured, how we will be received by those that have gone before us and by the Lord himself. It's awesome. When he gets to Rome, Paul is given by the Roman government divine protection, providential protection, I should say, given Roman guard. He's put under house arrest, okay? But because his case is weak and he's not a threat, he's given a large amount of freedom. So he's given a private home to live in. He's given Roman guard to protect him, which you might think that is imprisonment, but it's the softest kind of imprisonment, and it's safety as well because the Judaizers can't get to him. So God basically isolates and insulates Paul with providential provision, a free house, free food, and a private guard, but an open house, and he's able to receive people, and people are freely coming and going from Paul's house, both Jews and Gentiles, and even, he's going to say in the book of Philippians, even people that were operating guard and keeping Caesar's household, that were serving and keeping him, they become believers, and a church forms even in the household of Caesar, which is Nero. Nero becomes the most ardent oppressor of Christians in Rome in the next few years from this moment chronologically, but in this moment that hasn't begun yet, and a church is being formed right in Caesar's household, which is so cool, so providential. It shows you the power of the gospel despite political disfavor. So we don't have to have a political peaceable moment in terms of governance. We don't have to have a geopolitical kingdom. No, the gospel is powerful even under oppression, and that's being proven even today all around the world. So Paul welcomes people freely, Jews and Gentiles. The Jews listen to him initially, and you're going to read this account of him teaching all day, teaching them the gospel. Some believe, many do not. He rebukes them. From this moment, he says, salvation is going to be offered to the Gentiles. And for the next 2 years, this is where the book of Acts ends. For 2 years, Paul lives in Rome and leads people to Christ. And a church grows up in Rome, and he has no issues, no adversaries. And the book of Acts closes here. And I need a few more minutes because the reading for this week hasn't finished, but this is a major turning point. It's a major shift in the biblical narrative. So let's talk about the story of Acts just briefly. Paul is in Rome. During these 2 years, he writes the New Testament books that we haven't gotten to yet of Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon. So just kind of make a mental note. Paul's going to not only preach and teach, he's going to do a lot of writing these 2 years. And those books he's going to write are letters to churches at Philippi, Philippians, Ephesus, Ephesians, Colossae, Colossians. And Philemon is an old friend of his. Okay, so letters, we call them epistles, are going to grow out of Paul's time in Rome. The book of Acts, though, leaves us hanging. What happens? What happens? Well, we can stitch together some breadcrumbs from Paul's accounts in later epistles. He later is released from Rome, and he goes on another adventure. He goes on another missionary journey. Maybe Luke goes with him. We know that journey in some part takes him up to the northern coast of Greece because he is there when he writes to Titus and asks Titus to come to him. He left Titus in Crete at some point, and he asked Titus to come and meet him up on the northern west coast of Greece. We also get the idea that Paul took the gospel all the way to Spain. And we know that by the time he writes 2 Timothy, that he is back in Rome, and this time he's for real imprisoned in a dungeon-like prison, probably solitary confinement in a deep, dark hole. It's a good chance that Luke is still with him and that Luke is transcribing the letter he writes to 2 Timothy as he's calling up the whole to Luke. And in that letter, he says, I'm now ready to be offered. I have finished my course. I have run my race. I have kept the faith. And a crown of rejoicing is waiting for me. So 2 Timothy is Paul's final words, his last letter right before he dies. And then he is martyred under Nero. I think it's Nero in Rome. But this is not that imprisonment. There's two imprisonments. And so don't get those two confused. This is the good. This is, for lack of a better sense of it, this is the good imprisonment. He's held hostage, so he can't really go anywhere. But he's essentially a free man with protection, doing the plan and purposes of God in Rome. Now that's the close of the written book of Acts. But the story of the book of Acts continues beyond Paul as the gospel continues to grow around the world and grow across the Western world. And then it crosses the Atlantic into the modern world. And so wherever you are on the planet, if you're a Gentile believer, believing the gospel and growing in local church life, you are not only a recipient of the story of the book of Acts as the gospel moved to Gentiles, but you are a continuation of the story. So as I pastor a church in Newington, Connecticut, in this modern day age, and we have a local church doing gospel ministry, we are continuing to write the story in our local context of the book of Acts, and so are you. So the chronological, let me back up, the narrative storyline of the New Testament pauses at this point. When you turn the page into your reading into the next book of the Bible, you are moving into a new genre of Scripture. You're not just moving into a new part of the story. We're actually going to go back in time a little bit chronologically. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the narrative is pausing. You say, does the narrative pick back up? It does in two ways. It picks up in what I would call the breadcrumbs of Paul telling us the stories in the epistles, the letters to the churches of what was going on in his life. But really, we've already chronologically come forward through that. So when we get to those epistles or books, we're going to go back a little bit and remember the story of Paul. Philippi, Philippians, Thessalonica, Thessalonians, Corinth, Corinthians. Those books are coming. But the Christian narrative, the redemptive narrative, if I could call it that, God's narrative of redemptive history that we've been following from Genesis to Exodus to Leviticus to Joshua to Judges, all the way through and through the Kings and then through the exile, which we haven't gotten to, and through the life of Jesus that we've already read, and now through the story of the apostles in the book of Acts that we've just completed. That redemptive narrative pauses. For the church age, we're living it. We're in it. It's happening, okay? And then the narrative picks up with prophecy in the book of Revelation, okay, which we call apocalyptic literature or the revelation of Jesus Christ, things that have yet to come in the narrative, things we're waiting to happen. So I just need you to kind of mark in your mind or in your notes, this is a major shift moving from the book of Acts. Our next book is the book of Romans. So I want to introduce the genre, and then I want to introduce Romans, and then we're going to talk quickly about chapters 1 and 2. The genre now, moving forward from Romans, is instructions to local churches and to Christians. This is teaching literature. This is not storytelling literature. This is didactic teaching. This is instructions from Paul, from God, from the Lord Jesus, through Paul, as he was giving instructions to his local churches, and really teaching us as modern day believers, first century believers, yes, but all through the centuries. We're going to begin learning, what does the Christian life look like? What is it theologically? Not only what is it redemptively in terms of the story of Jesus, but what is it now theologically? We're going to get into doctrines. We're going to get into the framework of Christianity and the framework of New Testament church life. How is God going to work in this time, in this period, in this age, through his church? And how do we as believers enjoy and grow up in and live out our Christian lives? So we call these books of the Bible, and most of them are short, much shorter than the books we've been reading. We call them epistles. That's a formal word. It's an academic word a little bit. You'll become more familiar with it the more you engage with your Bible. Epistle. What is an epistle? It's a letter. It's simply a letter. It's a correspondence. So Paul becomes a letter writer, and he's going to write doctrines and letters to Christians all around the world. I'm no apostle. I don't believe in modern day apostles. Paul was an apostle, but Paul set an example for us that we are all messengers, and we should all do our best to be messengers to who God calls us to be messengers to. In Paul's day, it was writing letters to the churches that he had planted and established on his missionary journeys. So as he's journeying, he's going to sit down in one place and write a letter to the other place, and then send couriers to carry those letters to instruct those churches of what he's doing and what they should be doing and how they should be functioning. And he's going to answer questions, and he's going to solve problems and tell them how to address issues in their churches. And in so doing, he's going to provide instruction in all these letters for our lives today and for our church lives today. And those instructions are transcendent. They transcend all time and all contexts, all cultures. And the local church of Jesus Christ has expanded around the world, and we still study all these letters today, and we still do church and worship Jesus and follow him in theological and practical ways from these letters. So these epistles are instructions, and they're instructions to individual believers as well as to corporate bodies of believers, groups of believers, not only how to live, but how to do church, how to be together, how to be at peace, how to love, how to do mission, and doctrinal instruction. What is salvation? How are we saved? What is the gospel? Not in storyline terms, but in theological, doctrinal terms, in teaching and instructional terms. So we get pretty much all of our New Testament gospel theology from these epistles when it comes to doctrinal terms. We get it in terms of a redemptive story from the whole story of the Bible, but we get it in instructional, doctrinal, theological terms from these letters, these correspondences that we call epistles. So the Gospels, this is a new section of the New Testament. The four Gospels are the narrative of the life of Jesus. Acts was the narrative of the story of Jesus continuing through his followers and through his church. So now we turn to letters, specific letters written to specific churches in specific cities. All of these that we're going to study in the next section are written by the Apostle Paul. And like I said, these four written while he was at Rome. There's other epistles, some written by John, some written by Peter, one written by James. And these epistles some of them are to specific churches like Corinth and Ephesus and Philippi and Colossae. Some are to just the broad body of Christians all over the world. 1st and 2nd Peter would be those. James, Jude, 1st and 2nd, 3rd John, Revelation. Revelation was written to the 7 churches of Asia Minor from John. So this is an entirely new section of Scripture. We're turning not just into a new part of the narrative, we're turning into a new set of instructions for the church. All right, quickly moving, let's talk about Romans. Romans, the theme of Romans is the gospel. I love Romans. You're going to love Romans. It's dense. I'm going to tell you, Romans is Paul's tour de force of what is salvation, what is God's plan of salvation. It is a legal courtroom argument in the strongest of terms, in the most legal of terms. It is heavily doctrinal. We get a ton of our salvation doctrine in strong, robust courtroom kind of terms. Romans is like God's legal document of defining salvation. Like the Constitution of the United States defines our governing framework. This book defines our framework of salvation. And it basically, in big picture, is going to teach us that gospel doctrine produces gospel growth and gospel living. Okay? So gospel doctrine is going to be how are we saved? Gospel growth is what does that gospel that saves us do to us? How does it change us? And gospel living is how do we live out of that reality, that good news, that gospel. This book, the reason I say we're going to move back a little bit in time chronologically is that this book was written on Paul's third missionary journey when he was at Corinth. We touched briefly on the third missionary journey when we were a week or two ago when we were reading the book of Acts. So as Paul was collecting that offering and going from city to city, when he went back to Corinth, this was after all the problems were repaired with the church at Corinth. Paul stayed at Corinth for a long time and enjoyed a restored ministry with them. And while he's there, he was burdened for the church at Rome. The church at Rome was started by God. This is so cool because we have record of who started so many different churches. The church at Rome, there's no record of who started this church. The best guess is that the believers that were saved at Pentecost, when Peter preached in Jerusalem early in the book of Acts, and 3,000 people were saved, and then a few days later, 5,000 people were saved. The best guess is that some of those people were visiting Jerusalem from Rome for Pentecost, and that they returned to Rome as believers and worshipers of Jesus, and that they started a church so that they could worship together and grow together. The thing about Romans is they never had, to our knowledge, they'd never had a New Testament church leader visit them and mentor them and disciple them. So they were working with the best information they had, but probably some flawed information. And so Paul was burdened that they get it right. And so from Corinth, he sits down at that beautiful Mediterranean location and writes a book. And this was, many would argue this is his best book, okay? But he writes this tour de force, this masterpiece of theology and gospel understanding back to the Christians at Rome, who are partially Jews and probably now partially Gentiles, but who are probably mostly Jewish in their practice. And he's wanting them to see that the laws of Judaism don't save us. They just convict us of guilt in the courtroom of heaven. But it's actually the grace of Jesus that saves us and shapes us and redefines our living. So no longer is Judaism going to define our living or religious ceremony or law or tradition. No, our living is going to be defined by the gospel and by a relationship with Jesus and through the principles of the gospel. So this is Paul's principles of the gospel being articulated throughout this entire letter. What else do I need to tell you about this letter? This is Paul's most clear and thorough summary of gospel doctrine. There are 5 parts to this book. I'm going to talk you through them quickly, and we're almost done for today. Part 1, the sinfulness of humanity. That's chapters 1 through 3. Read this book like you're sitting in court listening to an attorney argue the case, okay? And Paul's words are the argument. Chapters 1 through 3 introduce himself and the sinfulness of man and the justice of God. So chapter 1 establishes a strong case of the sinfulness of the human heart and man's inerrant defiant rebellion against God and reprobate condition. Sinfulness is systemic in us, and it's profoundly corrupt. Chapter 2 establishes in the first verse, you're inexcusable. Thou art inexcusable, O man. You can get the courtroom legal argumentation sense of this. This may have been written a little bit from Paul's lectures and debates and dialogue with Jewish leaders, even in Corinth. And he might have come out of those lectures and written down some of his thoughts given by the Spirit of God. But chapter 2 is that all are guilty and God's laws don't save us. So part 1 is chapters 1 through 3 that establishes our guilt, our sinfulness, and the wrath, or another word for wrath is justice. The righteousness of God demands that he express justice against sin. So that's why the courtroom setting. We're talking about justice through this book and therefore justification. In light of the justice of God condemning me guilty, how could I ever be justified or declared innocent in the eyes of God? This is what the book of Romans is going to answer. Part 2 of the book is chapters essentially 4 to 8, and that is grace. And that part really breaks down into 2 sections. First part of part 2 is salvation by grace, chapters 4 and 5. And then part 2b is like sanctification by grace. That's chapters 6 to 8. We'll talk about all these chapters as we get through them. Part 4 then, or 3, depending on how you want to break it down, is the salvation of Israel, chapters 9 to 11, which is kind of a parenthetical flow to the book. 9 to 11. Parenthetical, but not. You'll see it when we get there. And then the last part of the book is chapters 12 to 16, and that is salvation or the gospel lived out as we do the will of God. One author, one book that speaks to these things, Pastor Skip Heitzig, breaks it down this way. The wrath of God, chapters 1 to 3. The grace of God, chapters 4 to 8. The plan of God, chapters 9 to 11. And the will of God, chapters 12 to 16. So this is a tremendous book. It's one of the best and most dense and thickest, theologically, thickest books in all the Bible. It's not a long book. It's 16 chapters, but it's going to teach us a lot. And I'm glad that we're going to go maybe a couple chapters at a time because there's a lot here. So I encourage you to take your time. I would love to really engage on these books. So if you have questions, write them in the comments. Let's dig in together. Let's enjoy the journey through Romans and then 1st and 2nd Corinthians as we move forward and see what God has to teach us. I will look forward to reading your comments and engaging with your questions. I am enjoying this journey. I hope you are too. I want to remind you, the Done Book, 2nd edition, is available. It's a great way to give people the message of the book of Romans, the salvation, the gospel message in about 100 pages. It's easy to read. It's available at inthegospel.com. Lots of people have trusted Christ because of this book. I hope you will use it as a witnessing tool in your resource library. I am praying for you, and I will see you tomorrow.